is 1397. The three kingdoms of Denmark, Norway and Sweden are united under a single monarch in the Kalmar Union. These Nordic countries made up the largest kingdom in Europe at the time, and was very powerful whenever things were agreed upon. However, this union would not last. During the 14th century, a Germanic confederation of merchant guilds and towns had sprung up along the Baltic coast. This was the Hanseatic League, and they came to dominate trade within the region. War soon erupted between the two rivals. Constant battles were fought, leading to severe trade disruptions, while taxes within the Kalmar Union rose. This led to some unhappy Swedes, and revolts and rebellions became more frequent. To solve this problem, the Danish king Christian II invaded, and once successful invited many Swedish nobles to a banquet promising amnesty. On the evening of the 7th of November, Danish soldiers entered the Great Hall with lanterns and torches, and many guests were then murdered or taken for imprisonment. Over the following days, anyone who opposed Christian was executed. Around 100 people, either noblemen, bishops or commoners, were murdered by hanging or decapitation. It is reported Christian even ordered the leader of the anti-unionist faction, Sten Sture, be dug up out of his grave and burnt. However, the survivors of this Stockholm bloodbath were not terrified into submission, but outraged. A man named Gustav Eriksson was furious, as his father had fallen victim to the atrocities. He rallied support from his fellow Swedes, and in 1523 they defeated Christian, declaring Sweden independent and free, with Gustav as king. With the execution of many Swedish nobles, Gustav had little resistance as king. After defeating a small peasant uprising, he proved to be a good administrator and diplomat. In becoming a Protestant nation, Gustav seized all church property, allowing him to pay his debts to the Hanseatic League, who had contributed to the liberation. Denmark was soon engaged in a civil war, known as the Count's Feud, and the Hanseatic League was falling into decline. All this allowed Gustav to build a centralised state, making numerous reforms and laying the foundations for modern Sweden. But the Swedish Empire truly began in 1611, with a new 16-year-old king, Gustavus Adolphus, who unfortunately inherited three ongoing wars, with Denmark, Norway, Russia and Poland-Lithuania. The Danish king Christian IV saw the opportunity to invade Stockholm at the death of the previous king. Gustavus, greatly outnumbered, knew the Danes were on their way, but with a stroke of genius, Gustavus ordered every civilian man to change into uniform to make it appear he had a much larger army. The Danes, compelled by what appeared to be a large army, never attacked, and many of the mercenaries in the Danish army deserted. The war with Denmark-Norway would end less than a year later. From here, Sweden went on to annex territory in the Baltic. Having already gained the Duchy of Estonia from a crumbling Livonian confederacy, Sweden marched into Russia, seizing key ports and rivers. Sweden was also still embroiled in the war with Poland-Lithuania, and Gustavus wanted to improve Sweden's navy situation. At the time, Sweden had many setbacks. In 1625, a squadron of 10 ships were caught in a storm and ran aground. A few years later, another squadron was attacked by Polish-Lithuanian forces. In this attack, two considerably large ships were lost, the Tiger, which was captured, and the Sun, which was blown up by her own crew. So Gustavus decided it was time to build one of the greatest ships ever built. So great it would rival the warships built even into the Napoleonic era. At 70 metres long and 50 metres high, the mighty warship Vasa was created in Stockholm. She was loaded with 64 heavy bronze cannons, ready to dominate the seas. On the day of her maiden voyage, she left the port of Stockholm with thousands gazing at her glory. 1,400 yards later, she sank. On land, Gustavus had more success in the battles against Poland-Lithuania. Victory for Sweden resulted in the control of Livonia, as well as the right to 2/3 of all shipping tolls in the ports of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This would prove vital for Sweden's entrance into the 30 Years' War, where she would rise to prominence. At the time, most European armies consisted of mercenaries who were recruited as units and created the foundation of a national army. but Gustavus had employed a regular standing army, who were loyal, well-trained and equipped with fine weapons, and when mercenaries were hired, they were well-trained. The year is 1630 and Sweden joins the 30 Years' War. The Catholics were dominating the Protestants, but when Gustavus arrived, everything changed. Gustavus personally led his armies into battle and was a military genius. He had gained much experience in the wars against Poland and Lithuania, and seen the effectiveness of shock cavalry by the winged hussars. He essentially created the world's first light and mobile artillery. He also refined infantry tactics, deploying musketeers in with traditional pipe formations. Gustavus made his artillery light and mobile and showed just how effective his tactics were at the Battle of Breitenfeld, killing tens of thousands of men while only losing a handful of his own. After the 30 Years' War, Sweden emerged into a great power and was one of the few countries without a damaged infrastructure. The large number of other hostile countries for colonial expansion to the west, and is the reason Sweden did not become a full-fledged European power in the way that Spain, Portugal, France and Great Britain did. A small colony was founded in the valley of the Delaware River, called New Sweden, but with a lack of manpower it was later seized by the Dutch. The empire reached its territorial height in 1658, after another war with Denmark, but with all this territory, it brought many enemies. These enemies were Denmark-Norway, the Tsardom of Russia and Saxony, who were in a personal union with Poland-Lithuania. At the crowning of the teenage King Charles XII, they formed a secret alliance against Sweden. In 1700 the Great Northern War began. Sweden was at war on three fronts. In the years prior, the Swedish army had been reorganised in order to compensate for the lack of manpower and resources. Farmers within the empire were to provide the crown with a full regiment of 1,000 men complete with weapons and uniforms. This formed the Carolingian army, who were loyal, disciplined and fearsome, so they were prepared for a great war. They first attacked Denmark. The navy managed to outmaneuver a blockade and quickly sent troops into Denmark, threatening Copenhagen and forcing them out of the war in just a few months. Charles then deployed his forces into the Baltic, where the city of Narva was under siege by Russia. Charles arrived in Narva with 10,000 soldiers, matched against Russia's army of 40,000. The day after Charles' arrival, a blizzard descended upon the Russian camp, and without hesitation, Charles ordered his forces to attack. It was a great victory. Having ended the Russian advance, Charles pursued his forces into Saxony and won victory, pulling Poland-Lithuania out of the war. Russia was the last man standing and offered to return the territories it had taken except St. Petersburg. But in 1708, Charles launched an invasion into Russia with 40,000 troops, aiming to take Moscow. The Russians began to retreat and adopted scorched earth tactics, destroying anything that might be useful to the oncoming enemy. In 1709, the Russian winter set in, and Sweden lost half their army. At the Battle of Poltava, Sweden saw a crushing defeat. The relatively small size of the Carolingian army meant they could not take heavy losses. With this single battle, it saw the end of an empire.